Have you ever wondered what truly happens inside an empath after being hurt over and over again? Not on the surface, but internally, because the most dangerous damage is often invisible. An empath can smile, help others, stay calm, and still be silently collapsing beneath the weight of accumulated emotional pain. The human mind was never designed to absorb endless disappointment without consequence. And when an empath is repeatedly betrayed, ignored, manipulated, or emotionally drained, something begins to change deep within them. Their compassion shifts, their trust weakens, their inner world slowly transforms from openness into survival. The question is not whether repeated pain affects an empath. The real question is, what does that pain eventually turn them into? What many people fail to understand about an empath is that emotional pain does not pass through them quickly. It settles, it lingers, it embeds itself into their inner world in ways that are often invisible from the outside. While most individuals can compartmentalize emotional experiences to some degree, empaths tend to internalize them. They replay conversations, they analyze tone, silence, facial expressions, inconsistencies, and emotional undercurrents. Their minds are not simply reacting to events, they are trying to emotionally process every layer beneath the event. This is why repeated emotional harm affects an empath so profoundly. A single betrayal may hurt anyone, but repeated betrayals begin to reshape the empath's entire nervous system. Over time, they become emotionally overstimulated, mentally exhausted, and psychologically burdened by accumulated disappointment. The important thing to recognize is that this exhaustion rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It comes from patterns. Patterns of being unheard. Patterns of giving more than they receive. Patterns of constantly extending understanding to people who never truly attempt to understand them in return. An empath often carries emotional weight long after everyone else has moved on. They remember how someone made them feel, especially when that feeling involved rejection, manipulation, emotional neglect, or cruelty disguised as normal behavior. And because empaths naturally search for meaning and emotional truth, they frequently turn inward after being hurt. Instead of immediately blaming others, they ask themselves difficult ELT questions. Was I too sensitive? Did I expect too much? Could I have handled it differently? This constant self-examination can become psychologically dangerous when the empath is surrounded by people who repeatedly invalidate their emotional reality. What makes this even more complex is that many empaths continue functioning while silently deteriorating internally. They still show up for people, they still offer support, they still appear calm and compassionate. But beneath that surface, emotional fatigue is building. The human mind can only absorb unresolved emotional tension for so long before it begins to manifest physically and psychologically. Anxiety increases, sleep becomes restless, emotional reactions become sharper, trust weakens, and eventually the empath begins to feel emotionally unsafe in environments where they once felt connected. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about human nature. People often assume strength is measured by emotional hardness, by the ability to feel less. But empaths reveal a different truth. True emotional sensitivity is not weakness. In many ways, it is an advanced form of awareness. The problem is that awareness without protection becomes suffering. When an empath repeatedly absorbs emotional damage without boundaries, they slowly lose their sense of internal stability. And this is where the real danger begins, not when the empath becomes emotional, but when they become emotionally numb. Because numbness in an empath is rarely indifference. It is accumulated pain reaching its psychological limit. People should remember this carefully. The deepest emotional wounds are often carried by those who spent the most time pretending they were fine. What happens next inside an empath is often misunderstood by the people around them. After repeated emotional injuries, something begins to shift. Not suddenly and not dramatically at first, but gradually, quietly. The empath who once responded with endless patience begins to hesitate. The person who once made excuses for everyone else's behavior starts pulling back emotionally. And many people interpret this transformation incorrectly. They assume the empath has become cold, bitter, or detached. In reality, what they are witnessing is self-protection emerging after prolonged emotional exhaustion. Empaths are naturally oriented toward connection. Their instinct is to understand rather than condemn. Even when hurt, they often search for context before reacting. They try to see the pain behind someone's behavior. They rationalize, they forgive. They give second chances, then third chances, and sometimes far more than that. But there comes a point where constant emotional giving creates an imbalance so severe that the empath can no longer ignore its psychological cost. The human mind is designed to adapt to repeated experiences. If someone repeatedly encounters emotional safety, trust deepens. But if someone repeatedly encounters betrayal, dismissal, inconsistency, or manipulation, the nervous system adapts differently. It becomes vigilant, defensive, protective. This is not pessimism, it is survival psychology. An empath who has been hurt too many times begins to monitor emotional risk more carefully. They stop revealing everything they feel. They become selective about who has access to their inner world. Conversations become more guarded. Emotional availability becomes conditional rather than automatic. And perhaps most significantly, they begin learning the difference between empathy and self-sacrifice. EICAL because many empaths unconsciously confuse love with endurance. They believe caring deeply means tolerating deeply. They stay in draining relationships longer than they should because they hope understanding will eventually heal dysfunction. But wisdom eventually teaches them something painful. Understanding someone's wounds does not excuse the damage they cause. That realization changes an empath internally. They start recognizing that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And for many empaths, boundaries do not emerge naturally. They emerge through pain, through disappointment, through finally realizing that constantly saving others can slowly destroy your own emotional stability. There is also a philosophical dimension to this transformation. Society often praises empathy in theory but punishes it in practice. Emotionally sensitive people are frequently expected to absorb more, tolerate more, forgive more, and remain endlessly available regardless of how they are treated. Over time, the empath begins to see the imbalance clearly. They recognize that some people are attracted not to their kindness, but to their willingness to overextend it. So the empath changes, not because they stop caring, but because they finally understand that caring for others without caring for themselves creates emotional collapse. Distance becomes necessary. Silence becomes necessary. Discernment becomes necessary. And ironically, this new version of the empath is often stronger than the old one. Less naive, more emotionally intelligent, more aware of who deserves access to their energy and who only consumes it. Because eventually, every empath learns a truth that changes their life forever. Protecting your peace is not cruelty, it is emotional maturity. One of the most psychologically exhausting experiences for an empath is the internal conflict that develops between what they feel emotionally and what they know intellectually. This conflict becomes especially intense after repeated emotional pain, because even when evidence clearly shows that someone is harmful, dishonest, manipulative, or emotionally unavailable, the empath often continues searching for the good within that person. And this creates a painful division inside the mind. Empaths are naturally inclined to perceive human complexity. They rarely see people as entirely good or entirely bad. Instead, they notice wounds, fears, insecurities, and emotional histories. They sense potential in people, sometimes even more than people see in themselves. While this ability can create deep compassion and meaningful connection, it also creates vulnerability. Because the empath does not only respond to who someone is in the present moment, they respond to who that person could become. And that is where the internal struggle begins. An empath may intellectually recognize unhealthy behavior. They may clearly see patterns of disrespect, emotional inconsistency, dishonesty, or neglect. Logic tells them the relationship is damaging. Reality confirms it repeatedly. Yet emotionally, they still feel attached to the possibility of change. They continue remembering moments of kindness, moments of vulnerability, moments that suggest the person is capable of becoming better. So internally, two opposing forces begin competing for control: emotional hope and psychological truth. This tension drains enormous emotional energy. The empath starts living in a state of cognitive and emotional contradiction. One part of them is trying to accept reality, while another part is trying to preserve emotional attachment. They question themselves constantly. Am I giving up too soon? Am I being unfair? What if they're struggling internally? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a deeply reflective mind attempting to reconcile compassion with self-preservation. But repeated exposure to emotional harm eventually creates mental fatigue. The empath begins realizing that understanding someone's pain does not remove the consequences of their behavior. This realization is profoundly difficult because it forces the empath to confront one of the hardest truths in human relationships. Love alone cannot heal dysfunction that another person refuses to confront. Philosophically, this speaks to a broader human tendency. Many people confuse potential with reality. They fall in love with who someone might become instead of honestly accepting who that person consistently chooses to be. Empaths are especially vulnerable to this because their emotional perception is future-oriented. They instinctively nurture possibility, but possibility without accountability becomes illusion. And living inside illusion eventually fractures emotional stability. The empath becomes traumatized, popped between intuition and denial. Their nervous system senses danger, but their emotional attachment keeps reopening the door. Over time, this creates anxiety, emotional confusion, and deep internal exhaustion. They begin doubting their own judgment because their empathy keeps conflicting with observable reality. Eventually, however, repeated pain forces clarity. The empath begins understanding that compassion should never require self-abandonment. They realize that seeing goodness in someone does not obligate them to tolerate repeated harm. And perhaps most importantly, they learn that emotional wisdom is not merely the ability to understand others, it is the ability to understand when someone's presence is destroying your inner peace. Because there comes a moment when an empath must choose between saving the connection and saving themselves. And that choice changes everything. After prolonged emotional pain, many empaths reach a stage that confuses the people around them the most. They become quiet, distant, emotionally unavailable. The warmth that once defined them begins to disappear, and others often interpret this change as indifference or emotional weakness. But internally, something far more serious is happening. The empath is not losing the ability to feel. They are becoming overwhelmed by the burden of feeling too much for too long. Emotional numbness is rarely the absence of emotion. More often, it is the nervous system's response to chronic emotional overload. When a person experiences repeated disappointment, betrayal, invalidation, or emotional exhaustion without sufficient recovery, the mind begins protecting itself by reducing emotional responsiveness. This is not a conscious decision. It is psychological survival. For an empath, this stage can feel deeply disorienting because emotional connection has always been central to their identity. These are individuals who once absorbed the emotional atmosphere of every room they entered. They noticed subtle shifts in tone, energy, and behavior. They cared instinctively, deeply, automatically. So when they suddenly feel detached from emotions they once experienced intensely, they often begin questioning themselves. Why don't I feel the same anymore? Why am I withdrawing from people? Why does everything feel emotionally heavy? The answer is simple, though painful. The mind can only endure you. Unresolved emotional strain for so long before it begins shutting certain doors internally. This withdrawal often happens gradually. The empath stops explaining themselves as much. They stop initiating conversations. They reduce emotional vulnerability because vulnerability no longer feels safe. Social interaction begins feeling exhausting instead of energizing. Solitude becomes preferable to connection because solitude no longer carries the same emotional risks that relationships do. And what makes this especially tragic is that many empaths continue appearing functional on the surface during this process. They still go to work. They still fulfill responsibilities. They may even continue supporting others emotionally. But internally, they are disconnected from themselves. The emotional fatigue has become so normalized that they no longer recognize how depleted they truly are. Philosophically, this reveals an important truth about human beings. Emotional suppression is not the same as healing. Modern culture often encourages people to move on quickly, to stay productive, to remain emotionally composed regardless of internal suffering. But emotions that are constantly ignored do not disappear. They accumulate beneath awareness until numbness replaces presence. And numbness is dangerous because it creates distance not only from pain, but from joy, meaning, and connection as well. The empath who once felt deeply connected to life may suddenly feel emotionally flat. Conversations lose depth. Relationships lose warmth. Even personal passions begin feeling muted. This is the psychological cost of unresolved emotional injury. Yet there is something important to understand here. Withdrawal is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the psyche attempting to recover from prolonged emotional damage. Sometimes silence is the mind asking for restoration after years of emotional overstimulation. But healing only begins when the empath stops treating their exhaustion as something to hide. Recovery requires honesty. It requires boundaries. It requires recognizing that constantly carrying the emotional weight of others while neglecting your own inner world eventually leads to emotional collapse. Because a person cannot remain emotionally open while continuously living in environments that punish vulnerability. Eventually, even the deepest heart learns to close its door when pain becomes its most familiar visitor. But if the story ended with emotional exhaustion, withdrawal, and numbness, then repeated pain would serve no purpose beyond destruction. What ultimately changes an empath is not simply the experience of suffering itself, but what suffering eventually forces them to understand. Because after enough emotional disappointment, a transformation begins to take place. Slowly, the empath starts rebuilding their inner world with a new level of awareness, one grounded not only in compassion for others, but in respect for themselves. This transformation is rarely dramatic at first. In fact, it often begins quietly. The empath starts saying no without excessive guilt. They stop over-explaining their boundaries. They become more selective about who receives their time, energy, and emotional access. And while these changes may appear small externally, internally they represent a profound psychological shift. For most of their lives, many empaths operate from the belief that love means constant availability. They feel responsible for maintaining emotional harmony, fixing conflict, supporting wounded people, and preserving relationships at almost any personal cost. But repeated emotional pain eventually exposes the flaw in that mindset. The empath begins realizing that unconditional compassion directed outward, without equal compassion directed inward, creates imbalance. An imbalance sustained over time becomes suffering. This realization changes the way they see themselves and the people around them. They stop confusing self-sacrifice with kindness. They stop romanticizing emotional endurance as proof of loyalty. Most importantly, they begin understanding that boundaries are not barriers to love, they are conditions for healthy love to survive. Psychologically, this is the moment the empath moves from emotional reactivity into emotional maturity. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this connection alive?" they begin asking, "Is this connection healthy for me?" That single shift changes everything because it places self-awareness alongside empathy rather than beneath it. And something else begins happening during this stage. The empath's sensitivity, which once felt like a burden, starts becoming a source of wisdom. They become more discerning, more intuitive, more capable of recognizing emotional patterns early. They no longer ignore red flags simply because they see someone's potential. They learn to pay attention not just to words but to consistency, accountability, and emotional reciprocity. Philosophically, pain often serves as a brutal but effective teacher. Human beings rarely develop deep self-awareness during periods of comfort. It is often suffering that forces people to confront their limits, reevaluate their beliefs, and redefine what they will tolerate. For the empath, repeated hurt becomes the catalyst for emotional evolution, not because pain is noble, but because survival eventually demands transformation. And perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is that the empath does not lose their ability to care. They simply stop abandoning themselves in the process of caring for everyone else. Their compassion becomes wiser, more balanced, more intentional. They learn that protecting their peace is not selfishness, it is responsibility. This is where healing truly begins, not when the empath stops feeling deeply, but when they finally understand that their depth deserves protection too. Because the strongest empath is not the one who absorbs endless pain in silence. The strong STEMPHYIS, the one who learns when to walk away, when to protect their energy, and when to choose themselves without apology.